Hi again, it's Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. What comes next? Today we're discussing a time when there was no next, an eternal present called capitalist realism. A book by that title came out 10 years ago. In the intervening decade, much has changed. Today we're going to draw out some threads from the late Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, which had a huge impact when it came out. We'll also discuss whether it's now out of date. This is the third part of our series on Neoliberal Breakdown. 2 episodes ago we discussed the psychological effects of the dislocations of the past decade, what we called Neoliberal Order Breakdown Syndrome. That syndrome is a response to the return of big events. The 2008 economic crisis, 2011 and Occupy, which brought back the discourse of economic inequality by speaking for the 99%. The Arab Spring that brought the potential for revolution back to popular consciousness. The 2013 global protest wave, and most notably in 2016, Brexit and Trump. The second part of the series discussed liberalism in a historic context, and how liberalism is unable to realize its own values. Now, in this third part, we're going to discuss that weird period between the end of the Cold War and the 2008 economic crisis, of neoliberal triumphalism combined with a mood of depressive hedonia. There's no future, so let's just live for now.
Yeah, so on today's episode, we're discussing Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism Is There an Alternative?, which was published by Zero Books in 2009. At only 81 pages, it isn't a long book, but as Alex mentioned, in spite or perhaps because of its brevity, it's been extremely widely read amongst the left. It's also probably the fullest expression of Fisher, who sadly passed away in 2017's thought. For listeners who haven't read the book, it captures well and attempts to explain the then pervasive sense amongst the British left that radical political change was not on the horizon of mid-2000s politics. The central idea is that the notion of TINA, or there is no alternative, is widely accepted not only in the political sphere, but it's also started pervading a whole range of other spheres of life: work, mental health, the bureaucratization of everyday life, popular culture, and so on. Fisher explores all of these in the book. So, in perhaps a similar way to Herbert Marcuse's 1964 One-Dimensional Man, it's an occasionally downbeat read, as it looks to account for some of the cultural sources of the absence of radical politics. But it's also laced with interesting ideas, cultural references, and a whole range of applications of the theory of capitalist realism to life and politics. It's also a very well-written and readable book. So in our discussion, I think we're going to try and unpack a bit more about what Fisher meant by capitalist realism and whether we still live in a capitalist realist moment. But before we move on to that, Alex, when did you first read the book? What was the context? Did it make a big impression on you?
Yeah, I mean, I read it shortly after it came out. I mean, it was probably around 2009. I was going to say 2008, but I don't know if it was published yet, so I'm not going to get some hipster cred for having read the book before it came out or anything. But for me, it made a massive impact just because it opened my eyes to various things, which I'm sure we'll come on to discuss. But I guess a way of politicizing mental health in a way that didn't just rely on ways of looking at it through the lens of medicalization. Points about bureaucratization, that kind of late capitalism or neoliberalism actually creates more bureaucracy despite its pretensions to do the opposite. And just more generally provided more of a grounding to at least my own subjective sense that we lived in a world of an eternal present. Like, there's no future. People are disconnected from the past. There's nothing really to look forward to in the future. Things are just going to carry on in a sort of eternal present. And I think that was the appeal of the book, you know.
Jolly stuff. So Ben, when did you first come across this text?
Well, I read it, I think, in 2014. I was at that stage on a road trip in South Africa from Cape Town to Durban with my then girlfriend. And I read it on a stop which we had for a few days around New Year's. It was Christmas 2014.
It is a Christmassy book.
In Nature's Valley, which is a beach sort of oasis of paradise. It's really nice. And I read the book there. And I remember thinking, I wasn't really didn't know that much about what was happening in the UK at the time because it didn't really interest me. I was more concerned with the drama of South Africa. That I was like, it sounds really bloody miserable out there. Is everyone really this depressed? And at the same time, I was actually the thing that really stood out for me from the book, and I reread it again after he passed away, and also there was also the Vampire's Castle essay, which we might discuss later, which was my other introduction to Mark Fisher, was that this guy has a really good music taste and also manages to write about some movies which I've seen in a really accessible manner that illustrates a point in a way that doesn't come off like Frederick Jameson, who's one of his Mark Fisher's idols, who you rarely have to reread the same paragraph about 10 times to understand what he's talking about. But anyway, no, I remember enjoying the book and also thinking it must be so tough living in the UK where it's so dark and grey. I'm just out here suntanning on a nice beach in a forest in South Africa. These are first world problems. We have mental health problems with different notes.
Absolutely. So Phil, how about you? When did you first read this book?
So I read it in the last 24 hours or so in preparation for the podcast. But that said, the reputation of the book certainly preceded it, not only with Alex raving about it for years and years and years, which made me feel that I didn't need to read it, but also other people as well have mentioned it to me in different contexts. I also saw Mark Fisher at a conference, which is interesting to see him in person because, again, his reputation had been slowly growing over that period, so I was curious to see him in person. And also I've read, occasionally dipped into his K-punk blog, which I thought was quite good and interesting. And in fact, my first the greatest exposure I had to Mark Fisher before this was the Vampire's Castle essay, which I was sympathetic to and some of I thought was brilliant, but I suppose bore the mark of that a certain style of 1990s kind of cultural theory, which I think is also evident in the book. It's got that kind of... I can only describe it as a paper mache feel of that kind of soft pulp cultural theory, which has been reconstructed into this shape. And despite that, it's a system of thinking or a style, a tradition of thinking, I suppose, which has its weaknesses, and we'll talk about that, I suppose. But it's to be said to his credit, he does make some of these thinkers, manages to illustrate their thought and to explain some important aspects of their thought in a way that's very impressively arresting and simple and useful. So people like Baudrillard, Zizek, Jameson, Deleuze, and that's a useful intellectual service, I think, if nothing else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to round it out a little, I think I read this book when it probably when it just about had come out, and found it really rereadable, and also in some ways a good entry point to leftist theory. I think I gave this book to a number of people for misguided Christmas presents, and whether they read it or not, I'm not sure, but I think I think it's one of the books I remember at the time just enjoying reading and then going back and finding new things in, because I think it really does cover a wide range of topics in there, and also speaks about some good films and some good music, not universally good, but really enjoyable read. So I think that, to move on to the argument of the book, the big first question is, well, what is capitalist realism? So I think we can give a fairly kind of bare bones definition, and this is that I think the central idea, feel free, obviously, the three of you to disagree, and I'm sure you will very shortly. But Fisher starts with this now iconic phrase attributed to Frederick Jameson: "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And I see the whole book as just the application of this idea through his distinguishing this from postmodernism into various different spheres of everyday life. So I think this idea that he puts it, capitalism seamlessly occupies the horizons of the thinkable. That's what he's really looking at. How is it that this idea that there's no alternative to capitalism, socialism's failed, how has that spread, and what are its consequences? So Alex, I think you had a point here on the distinction with postmodernism, which Fisher talks about in the book, and is one of the closest ideas to capitalist realism.
Yeah, I guess it's a way of, I'm not adding too much here, but it's just a way of, he delineates it explicitly from postmodernism, and I think he makes a good point here, and without getting too much into the philosophy of what is postmodernism, but that postmodernism, I think people can trace its origins or its kind of the starting moment of postmodernism to the early 1970s, when this modernist social housing project in St. Louis was blown up. As in blown up as in demolished. And that was the kind of beginnings of postmodernism. So postmodernism arises at a point where it's still fighting against modernism. It's trying to take down or disrupt or fragment something that it sees as this sort of big monolithic, wrongly in my opinion, but it sees as this big monolithic enterprise, monological enterprise. And as a consequence, it has a sense of what is out, sort of outside it. Postmodernism still exists when you have the Soviet Union and really existing socialism around. So you have a kind of outside to neoliberal capitalism. And I guess Mark Fisher's argument is that capitalist realism is one step further. It's what happens after that defeat, after the conclusive defeat, where the period in which politics is defeated has already been forgotten. So you live in this period without memory, the eternal present. And I think that's what is appealing about the notion of capitalist realism, or was appealing about the notion of capitalist realism.
So I think, he absolutely says there are 3 points at which postmodernism and capitalist realism can be distinguished, and I think one of them is absolutely that relationship between postmodernism and modernism. Postmodernism obviously assumes that there is some kind of live relationship, whereas capitalist realism takes it for a fact that modernism is dead. And secondly, that sense of exhaustion that Fisher talks about, that kind of the sense that, with the defeat of organised labour in the 80s, there's no real currently existing alternative. There just feels like the left is out of energy and out of ideas. And the third one, and I thought this would be interesting to throw to all of you, is that he talks about this idea that there's been a generation of people who've grown up and been socialized after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this is people who maybe studied politics in the 2000s, myself in this group, and that for this generation, I guess he talks about this idea of pre-corporation, that what we're dealing with now is not the incorporation of materials that previously seemed to possess subversive potentials, but instead the preemptive formatting and shaping of desires, aspirations and hope by capitalist culture. He talks about Kurt Cobain, this idea that basically even cultural kind of critique or rebellion is already cliched, and even recognizing that it's cliched is also cliched. So I'm guessing, maybe Ben, Phil, did this resonate with you, given the timing of your political socialization?
It was the weaker. I thought actually one of the weakest points was trying to kind of, I don't know, Kurt Cobain, such a massive pussy, and trying to make something of him as a failed kind of hero who tried to kind of rebel, impotently flailing his fists against the wall of capitalist realism. That I just didn't buy at all.
I think he portrays him specifically, precisely as a pathetic figure. I mean, that's the whole point, that it's a pathetic figure.
No, but he gives him kind of some kind of romance and tragedy as a failed attempt at rebellion. And I didn't get it. I didn't get that, and I didn't see it. And I think I suppose one thing that's interesting, the idea of capitalist, really, he mentioned somewhere that it's kind of clearly a play on the idea of actually existing socialism, which is the moniker that the Soviet bloc gave to itself towards in the last kind of third of its existence, when it was clear that it wasn't going anywhere. And so I think there's just so much more potential to the idea than he gives to it. And I'd say, still there is, it still clearly applies. We'll get into this more, but there's no, very evidently that there is, even though I suppose the point is capitalism has been delegitimated over the last 10 years of the economic crisis, without any kind of meaningful, authentic or powerful alternative being offered to it.
I think I would actually kind of agree with him about Kurt Cobain. I mean, like, Kurt Cobain is a little bit before our time. I mean, all of us in the early 90s. But at that stage, it really did represent some sort of failed, out of like a failed generational aspiration of Generation X to be rebellious when they really weren't. I think that sort of stood in. But I had a very different interpretation of the book because of my own context. I read it in South Africa. I really didn't have the same formation as you guys to an extent because, like, I was living in a place where is overwhelmingly dominated by politics, and everyone talks about politics. Politics is the subject of almost every interaction in some ways, but it's all coded through sort of racial interactions in South Africa. And in some ways, the closest to capitalist realism there is the sort of, and it's something completely different, and it's almost similar to Brazil, but still very different. You have the white minority to an extent accepting the trappings of cultural rebellion imported from the United States or Europe as some sort of way of identifying itself in alliance with subcultures there, while really being separated from what's happening in the majority of people's houses and communities in South Africa, in terms who are mostly black. So you have the sort of cultural separation in that what counted as rebellious stage in many ways in South Africa was among white communities during when I was an adult. I think it was a little bit different during apartheid, which was more culturally conservative. Just really wasn't rebellious at all. It was just ways of sort of claiming some sort of subcultural affiliation with the West rather than creating something which was South African. So it really was a sort of different sort of performance, which is probably requires a whole different set of cultural.
So it's an interesting question. So, and it's a good one actually. I think to have is, I mean, surely so. You know, I'm sure, like you say, kind of reading Mark Fisher now as I did 10 years after it was published, it's very, like you say, kind of, the atmosphere is grey, drizzly rain, concrete estates, low clouds, and it's all of that, you know, kind of, so I can see how that comes across to anyone who's not, anyone reading it kind of in a different context. But surely, I mean, South Africa, even being outside, being kind of outside of Europe, and still with all of the turmoil and difficulties that it has on a day-to-day level, very clearly a post-political society in the post-Cold War era, right? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the ANC kind of tacking towards the centre, becoming effectively a one-party state over the last 30 years or so. The fact that the ANC became much more centrist and has tried to kind of portray the Rainbow Nation. I mean, that's, so South Africa also is very clearly post-political. So doesn't that tie into capitalist realism as well?
I disagree. I mean, to an extent, I would agree with you. There was the honeymoon phase of the Rainbow Nation, but that sort of fell to the side quite quickly. And the early 2000s, for instance, were really defined by the struggles around HIV/AIDS, which was definitely a political struggle, and it involved segments of the left, involved sort of mass politics. And then you also have the fact that in South Africa, the struggles just to sort of eke out a survival in a community or some access to basic services or to just get an inflation-based increase is always going to have a political aspect and require like a lot of confrontation. But like when I read this in the specific period, it was when like it seemed like South Africa had left the sort of ANC doldrums of what you would like if it was a post-political period. So from like 2011 to I would guess about 2014, it seemed like there was a big chance for left resurgence and politics and all sorts of debates and lots of things were happening, and it was definitely not a post-political society. And in the just because of the sort of, I would agree that that sort of hegemonizing of the center and that ability to think outside the ANC is very much a feature of the South African order, and I wouldn't disagree with your analysis. I would just hesitate to call it like post-political. In some respects, what you have is something which is, I guess, unrecognizable in the West, is in which you have a extreme set of high levels of protest. You have 12,000, 13,000 sort of street demonstrations or protests a year, probably the most per capita hours of strikes lost, without it taking a political characteristic in terms of like formal organized political parties or political aspirations. But I don't think I would go as far to call that post-political.
So I think this is an important point, just to remember the context in Britain, at least, where this book was published. There was a lot of worrying, even maybe a moral panic around apathy. There was this very acute sense, even from the elite, that people are not interested in politics. Well, why is this? And there are a whole range of explanations, and this is one of them that Fisher puts forward in Capitalist Realism. But I think one of the things that we want to kind of, particularly for listeners who perhaps haven't read the book, get across is the sense in which this kind of political, ideological debate or stalemate or exhaustion, however you might want to frame it, then has a whole set of impacts on various other forms of everyday life under neoliberalism, as you might put it. So Fisher draws on a whole range of illustrations in work, mental health, as Alex already mentioned, charity, bureaucratization of everyday life. Were there any of these illustrations or applications of the theory of capitalist realism that really anybody found particularly arresting on a reread, or even out of date now?
Well, actually, I mean, I guess as a starter, I would say that it's precisely the more determinate analysis that Fisher has, more kind of sociological aspects, which I think are still very relevant. Whereas maybe some of the mood music that he did, the sort of depiction of the mood, that I think is probably now out of date. But I think we'll come on to that. I mean, so just on one of the specific sort of analyses, I thought his description of bureaucratization and his analysis of that, which I think is like the single largest chapter in the book, which means that it's about, 10 pages or something. But he packs a hell of a lot of ideas into that short bit. He calls it market Stalinism. His basic argument is that late capitalism, like Stalinism, values the symbols of achievement over actual achievement. So you've got all this, anybody who's works in any university will be familiar with this, but it's all across sort of workplaces, all these targets and objectives and criteria which have to be met, which take up way too much of your time. He mentions Office Space to bolster his case, and with Mike Judge's 1999 film, which is really brilliant, and I actually rewatched that not too long ago, and it's still hilarious. I think his argument, actually there's a really funny point that he makes, is that although for all that we associate kind of top-down bureaucracy with, Stalinism, he argues that Stalinism couldn't even fully express its bureaucratic tendencies because it was associated with a social project like socialism, whereas stagnant late capitalism, because it doesn't have to have any pretense to a social project, can be as bureaucratic as it wants to be.
Just in terms of something that struck me rereading it, and again, it's something we can probably return to because it's a different political mood. But in some ways, I guess the sort of return of, like, you could call it identity politics in the last few years, and the sort of explosion of a culture industry around it, and the way that it's been so absorbed into capitalism is something that really sort of stood out, even though it's not really the specific examples in the book, because it's a different era. This is the sort of mid to late 2010s. But for instance, you have like Beyonce's appropriation of the Black Panther aesthetic when she was performing at the Super Bowl. You have the way in which people claim that someone's career success represents a sort of radical legacy, the legacy of a radical struggle, and the way in which sort of people use to commodify what is a legacy of resistance. And that's something which really fits into capitalist realism, I think, still. And it's something which I definitely experienced to extent in South Africa, where people can claim connection to a sort of celebrity winning an award as something which is a win for all black people in South Africa, as a win of representation in a context of when there's a lot of political battles happening, is something which I think still is true, and something which I think the specific mood music, as Alex puts it in the book, is very different to what this is. This is more exuberant aesthetics of power and rebellion, which don't really have that same political sort of feel as this period in the 2000s. And I think you also see that in the UK, where there's this sort of very, I mean, it's always been part of British culture, and I guess every culture because of American hegemony, but this sort of embrace of American aesthetics and ways of doing and ways of speaking as the sort of authentic way of doing politics or resistance, and sort of infiltrating student and pop culture in the UK over the last few years. You certainly see it in South Africa, and I think this is kind of like the contemporary sort of feel of capitalist realism in the sort of this sense, I think.
So, Phil, how about you? Was there anything that rang false in reading some of these applications of Tina to the rest of life under neoliberalism?
I suppose I'm not so taken with this portrayal of psychic pathology as the only way in which to describe oppression. So occasionally I think he gets some of these kind of issues wrong. So when he talks about stress as a kind of something which has been privatized, I don't think that's quite right. I mean, I think certainly the way in which we think about kind of workplace issues in terms of interpersonal problems that need to be managed by HR, or in terms of stress rather than in terms of particular kind of institutional problems or oppressive practices that could be addressed by some form of collective action or improvement in industrial relations. So, I mean, I think that is a genuine thing, but I don't, it's not as if you could change, it's not about changing the way in which we think about stress. It's rather to see that stress is a misconception of the problem. So, yeah, I think there's a tendency in the book, to render kind of all sorts of, he only understands, it seems to me, oppression in psychic or therapeutic kind of terms. And that seems to me problematic. The points about market Stalinism were brilliant, really well made, and interesting also because, I was familiar with that line from David Graeber's work on bureaucracy. And Graeber, as far as I know, doesn't really mention Mark Fisher at all, even though Mark Fisher's, the chapter on market Stalinism seems to basically lay out all of Graeber's points in advance before Graeber does the stuff on bureaucracy. So I thought that was interesting and good.
Well, Graeber's a bit of an egotist. He likes to get his own ideas passed as his own ideas, as someone who's been following his work for a while.
But the Utopia of Rules, which is where he talks about this, is a good read, listener. We should set up a kind of scheme where if people buy books that we recommend, we get a little cut, but we haven't set that up as yet. But yeah, so Alex, I think you also you mentioned off air this idea of depressive hedonia, this particularly amongst the youth as they were then described, that resonated with you.
What are they now? What are they?
Well, they're the podcasters, right?
Right.
So,
they're us.
Yeah.
We are us.
So the depressive hedonia point he makes, which I'll explain in a second, is one of those mood music bits, which I think is maybe not so relevant anymore. But we'll come on to evaluate that claim, I guess, in a second. I mean, so depressive hedonia, right? So depression is normally seen as an anhedonic state. It's a lack of desire. But he makes a point that kind of especially youth, teenagers, and so on in the 2000s in Britain were in the state of depressive hedonia, which is to say that you don't really have any real desires. You don't really have any genuine ambitions or views of the world or sense of a real future, collective or personal. And that's the depressive element. The hedonic element is tonight's the night, let's get fucked up, we're gonna have the best time ever, tonight's gonna be fucking epic, this is it, that kind of feeling.
The kind of idea that you have a feeling that tonight's going to be a good night.
Right, exactly, yeah. Fuck, man. Yeah.
Sorry.
But I know you make reference.
Keep that.
You make reference to that song, but there's a point. I think that song exemplifies more than anything just this really dumb 2000s presentist. Yeah, we're gonna get fucked up, but there's no sense of if you just listen to the lyrics, there's no sense of what's coming next.
It's a great song.
Whatever. There's this simmering kind of tension underlying this podcast of people's disagreement about music, which happened off air.
I have a really good point about this actually. But so the drug taste has changed. So especially in this period in the 2000s, and to extent early 2010s, the big drug of choice was all Molly. It was an upbeat. It was MDMA. It was
don't call it Molly. That's not what British listeners would not understand what you mean.
Or as they call it in Brazil, Michael Douglas. But
what, from falling down.
MDMA, Michael Douglas.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
But that's what it is.
There's a good hit song about it. Anyway, the point is that people, like, it's a hedonic drug. You already have to think about things. It ensures you can have a good night, a lot of energy for partying. But that was the mood. I think the switch, especially in the United States, I wouldn't be able to comment about the UK, having not really lived there. And is that by the time I was there, the 2014, 2015, the drug taste had gone completely away from sort of uppers to actual downers. So people were beginning to get very into opiates, very into Xanax. The whole culture was about trying to feel numb as a way of responding to trauma or anxiety or stress. It's no longer hedonia. It's kind of like the opposite. You're kind of like trying to it's like going down and being depressed is now seen as really cool. So like, people talking about like a lot of like, for instance, instead of where you had emo and as the sort of genre of the early 2000s, you have like emo rap, which is kind of like not very lyrical, but like kind of have some vague feelings about like my girlfriend left me and I feel terrible, but then we do a bunch of Xanax and like try to feel numb, as being the cool party aesthetic, which is a really different change in the mood. I mean, but in South Africa we also had like our response is like, you wouldn't call I thought the depressive hedonia was really interesting to think about South Africa, in which instead of having any way to deal with a country where almost everyone has PTSD to some level from seeing extreme violence or forms of oppression, people just do it through drinking and drugging and not talking about it as a sort of different response. But in some ways, it's sort of the feeling of trying to pretend that everything is good through a party. I think that feeling is kind of like past, at least in the US.
So this, I think, actually brings us on to probably the most interesting and important question that comes out of reading this short book is how does this relate to the current moment? Because this book, Capitalist Realism, is perhaps incredibly almost 10 years old. There's going to be a conference marking the 10th anniversary, and I know at least of one reading group running in London.
You're getting commission for the conference, or?
Not yet. I need a better agent.
Commissioning it kicked back through the podcast.
Yeah, but so as I was saying, I know of at least one reading group in running in London dedicated to the work of Mark Fisher, who was extremely influential, not just through his writing, but also through his teaching at Goldsmiths and some FE colleges. And actually, one of the elements of this is to do with rave culture and perhaps touches on some of the MDMA points that Ben just raised. So I guess the major question when looking back at this book or looking at it now is, as posed in a recent New Statesman article, whether capitalist realism is dead, or as they pose it, did Brexit kill Mark Fisher's theory of capitalist realism?
I think that's a really nice title. It's really catchy.
Yeah. So as Nicholas Barrett puts it in the New Statesman, this capitalist realism is dead argument can run in the following way. The fervour to win the global race for economic growth seems to have been replaced by a populist scramble to preserve cultural identities and a sense of economic agency. Politicians on both the left and the right now feel as though they have more to gain by biting Adam Smith's invisible hand than they do by shaking it. And interestingly, and I think this is one of the things that we really want to get down in discussing when relating this to the current moment, is whether this account of Brexit that's given in this New Statesman article is correct. So they say, or Nicholas Barrett rather says, Brexit is yet another reverberation of a chronic cultural addiction to the past. Fisher would certainly have recoiled from the more jingoistic elements, and we can only wonder whether he would have seen Brexit as a decisive blow to capitalist realism, or just another set of patriotic trumpets playing a song that wasn't particularly enthralling the first time. So the major question that I have to the three of you is, so 1989 to 2008, was the era of capitalist realism. What's the period we live in now?
Can I just jump in? I don't have a direct answer. But I think one of the features, I think particularly in this period of capitalist realism in Britain, was a lack of an institutional expression for any left-wing politics. People were reduced to sort of debating and reading groups and sort of sheltered enclaves in universities or bars, sort of real feeling of sort of like a subculture that was losing. whatever euphoria there had been or popularity there had been from the anti-war movement had now died down, and people like the Labour Party is here as Blairism to stay, and what counts as radical left politics is TM is like the Socialist Workers' Party, which we don't really want to be part of because it's kind of like a depressing subcultural experience in itself, or we kind of reduced to like having cultural commentary in the sidelines. But I think first, with the experience of, I guess, Occupy, the student movements, and to an extent UK Uncut and the things that came out of it, and then later with the changes in the Labour Party and the rise of Corbynism, it's now kind of easy to see where you would, if you want to get politically involved, where you could be. At least in the UK, and to a less extent in the US with the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America. But I really feel at this point, I mean, in the capitalist realism area, part of what he's talking about is like you just don't know what to do in terms of to make a difference because you don't have any, and you don't have any group identity in terms of working together. You have a bunch of individuals talking to each other,
and that's just the case for people who are already politicized in some way. Most people aren't, and the question doesn't even come up. Now you have a lot of people maybe who are questioning kind of politics, or maybe feeling that something should be done, but maybe not yet having the avenues or the answers, or even maybe the right questions for it, but feel like something has to happen, that things are moving. And I think that's the definitive difference from, you know, the current period compared to, you know, 2008. Like we've talked about in the previous podcast about a whole series of events, kind of the return of big events, which have led us to a point now where it feels like there's a certain opening. We don't know what that is.
I would just give it a slight twist, I suppose, to say, I mean, I think it's, you know, I'm not sure that most people would feel that there's movement, in Britain at least. I think the feeling would be more that there are issues that need resolution and that there is nobody in a position to meaningfully resolve them. So kind of stasis, blockage, which I think, you know, for a lot of people also will be mystifying. The idea that we're still kind of struggling with the most basic issues surrounding Brexit would be frustrating and strange to many people, regardless of how they voted. And as regards to Mark Fisher, you know, I mean, the thing about the New Statesman article is that Nicholas Barnett's piece exactly expresses what we talked about before, which is the nostalgia, the nostalgia for the immediate past rather than nostalgia for the 1950s.
So can we then say NOBS, or Neoliberal Breakdown Syndrome, is nostalgia for capitalist realism?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
so
basically
basically he's exactly expressing that. So I mean, we can't second guess how Mark Fisher would have approached Brexit, but certainly we can see that this guy has a chronic case of NOBS.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to focus this down a little bit more then, are we still in a capitalist realist moment? Is politics back, baby? Or have we entered the age of what the social theorist Matthew Thompson calls capitalist surrealism?
What's capitalist surrealism?
Capitalist surrealism is this idea that I think we've touched on previously, that reality, satire, and hyperreality are increasingly indistinguishable. So we've maybe reached this stage. I thought actually the way that Phil, you in particular, might answer this question is basically that this age of this book is past. That we actually have now, in British politics at least, and importantly without the left, seen a rejection of the idea that there is no alternative, particularly in Brexit. And the issue is now whether the left, and particularly maybe people the sort of people who would read and be very sympathetic to capitalist realism, whether they're able to catch up with that real movement of politics.
I think I think capitalist realism still holds, because one of the things that's striking is that the sense of capacity to intervene in the idea that political power can meaningfully shape economic outcomes is something that's absent on the left. I mean, if anybody's kind of, meaningfully on the left at least, it's something which is very kind of kept on the, it's kind of kept restrained. Occasionally it surfaces in speeches by Corbyn or McDonnell. But it's not something which motivates, the majority of the membership of the Labour Party, say, or the recent membership at least, or something which I think kind of Labour Party voters, a lot of Labour Party voters are thinking about. That might be different in, among kind of traditional working class northern Labour Party voters. So I think in that sense, the sense of capitalist realism is is still intact. Now, it's also worth mentioning, I suppose, insofar as it has been damaged and delegitimated, that was done from within. The nationalisation of the banks, the astonishing extent of government intervention in the economy in response to the crisis over the last 10 years, the way in which private debt was made effectively public through the sovereign debt crisis in the EU, all of that was undertaken through an attempt to rescue capitalism rather than through left intervention.
I think like regular listeners know that kind of Phil and I disagree about the Corbyn question, but I think what's quite interesting is I was just like thinking as you were saying that in terms of Mark Fisher's own fate, maybe it's worth maybe we can speak about later. But he wrote a essay famously critiquing sort of toxic cultures on the online left, in particular rising with neo identity politics, called The Vampire's Castle, in which he was really hounded and really cruelly attacked by commentators on the internet and real life to the point they wanted to ruin his life. Is that you really see that the capitalist realist left, if you think, because it's a group of individuals without political power or a shared political project that people feel united on, what they can do for modes of expression is just try to destroy people's lives, take them down, try and sort of, I guess, bully or shame someone as a feeling of collective power. And I think like if there's a post-capitalist realist left or like a real left project, which I have hopes is around Momentum and Corbyn, it's that it moves precisely from that sort of culture to trying to seek some sort of meaningful change, or what you were saying is trying to put political power over the economy back into the question. And you can totally see with the response from many leftists to Brexit, instead of like trying to think strategically about the future of the left, it's basically it's acting in the same fashion as people acted against Mark Fisher, trying to find the heretics and shame and attack them.
Yeah. So I guess, this is a very rich theoretical book. It's got a lot of different applications. There's a question whether this time has passed or not, but I think even that question is immensely generative. And just to maybe, before I offer it round for everybody for the final summing up point or that point you've just got to get off your chest, I think it's worth linking this back to the two episodes that we've just done, because this is the third in 3 episodes on liberalism and neoliberalism, the history, its breakdown, because I think this is essentially one of the books which paints a really interesting picture of neoliberalism or late capitalism from the left. And so it's really, that this is why we wanted to do an episode on this book, was to engage a little bit with this theory and think, how has the left seen this period that has dominated the political socialization of most of the listeners of this podcast, I'd imagine. So Alex, to go to you first, alphabetical order, to be kind of fair and
the justice of the alphabet, the infinite justice of the alphabet,
which I'd imagine you would defend, given that your name starts with A.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts? Any summing up?
Well, I mean, we haven't we haven't discussed consumerism, and I think that's an interesting element which kind of floats throughout the book, which is that the period that Mark Fisher describes, that we often think of this kind of postmodern moment of consumerist euphoria with all the kind of bright lights and flashing colors. Actually, they should be bright colors and flashing lights, rather than the other way around. But whatever, it's postmodern. You can let it all hang out. You can do what you want. That's a permissive hedonism of postmodernism. And he makes an interesting point, which is that maybe we kind of do need limits. That isn't a conservative argument necessarily, but some things which kind of establish some standards, some aspirations, some principles. This is actually a good moment to refer back to our episode with Angela Nagel a good couple of months ago now, where we talked a little bit about this, about the notion of self-expression, where we talked about transgression, and how that period now feels so empty. But it's partly also the fact that period of, let's say, from the end of the Cold War until 2008 was premised on selling consumerism. It was dependent on easy credit, some degree of rising GDP. And to the extent that that period had limits imposed, they were all limits of social control, justified consequentially. So That is to say, don't smoke, but not don't smoke because it's wrong, but don't smoke because it's bad for your health. There are negative consequences. And if there's going to be a return to politics, I think there also needs to be a return to a sense of what principles and desires should motivate us, which are internally determined, not just externally determined, like these are bad consequences, negative externalities that have to be guarded against. So I guess it's that point about kind of internal necessity rather than kind of external imposition and controls.
Interesting. Ben, final to come next in the alphabet, A, B, P. What are your final thoughts?
I just had an amazing wave of inspiration hit me about depressive hedonia in the current age, which is basically, if you have to look at Instagram, which I think Instagram is fast overriding Twitter and to extent Facebook as the most dominant and influential form of social media, especially for as Mark Fisher speaks quite in depth about people who don't really like reading or don't really want to read. It's a visual medium. Is that we in the age of the Instagram influencer, where you commodify your lifestyle into a successful career through Instagram, through basically documenting how good you have it. So we're in an age where you basically can get, if you have enough money, spend $20,000 on like being seen eating at good restaurants and having a great life, to becoming a food influencer who gets invited and paid to basically like show off how good the restaurant is and how great your lifestyle is. In some senses, it's the endless urge for that good time, just documented in Instagram stories, that is becoming the new sort of depressive hedonia, as complete commodification of your lifestyle, in which everything you do is basically targeted to be a public space to sell a product, which is your ability to influence others through how great your lifestyle is and how great you are documenting it.
That is, that was quite a wave of inspiration. I think that's a really good point. Phil, final thoughts.
I suppose the final thought would be how Mark Fisher skirts around, I think, what is the central issue.
Phil. Sorry to interrupt your flow. But just as you were starting, you're extremely fuzzy, like while you speak. Yeah.
Stop rustling those papers.
I'm not rustling.
It's definitely the mic. It's definitely the mic.
Hold on.
Didn't want the concluding bit to be all.
Sure. You gonna try again, George?
So, Phil, any final thoughts? Any last observations?
I suppose the issue which I think Mark Fisher skirts around, but isn't willing to fully develop, but I think he gets the central issue, which is the need, I think, or the central problem for the left is the need to restore authority. And he kind of touches upon this occasionally. He talks about it in cultural terms, where he talks about the fact about the old Reithian ideal of the BBC, which was this kind of stern paternalistic voice of the nation and appealed to and attempted to cultivate a public. And he talks about how this was the thing that kind of enchanted him, the public service-oriented BBC. He mentions Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, Harold Pinter plays, Tarkovsky seasons, the Radiophonic Workshop. So all of he mentioned, he has this idea of some kind of central organizing principle, some kind of central authority. And he says explicitly that a genuinely new left, this is on towards the end of the book, a genuinely new left should be not. Wait. The goal of a genuinely new left should be not to take over the state, but to subordinate the state to the general will. This involves naturally resuscitating the very concept of a general will, reviving and modernizing the idea of a public space. Now, I don't know about subordinating the state to the general will, but that sense of collective purpose and agency, and with it the idea of authority, I think that's the central question for the left, and the one which the left has the most difficulty addressing. So he touches upon some of this earlier in the book, where he's talking about the kind of the anti-authoritarian instincts of the 1968 left and how this is meshed in with capitalist realism. And we've touched upon some of these themes previously. So I think he gets, he's unwilling to kind of say it succinctly, but the central point is authority, the problem of authority, how to restore authority, and the fact that that's the task of the left and not of the conservative right. That's perhaps the most intriguing and most important element in the book, I think.
Well, I think this book has been particularly interesting for us to discuss because it touches on so many of the themes of the podcast, which we have previously described as being at the end of history. And I think that's one of the central questions that we're going to come back to again and again, listeners, is really, are we still living in capitalist realism? Is it capitalist surrealism, as Matthew Thompson says? Or I personally feel, and I'm going to abuse my position as a chair just a tiny little bit, I feel like things have changed a little bit. Like, one of the reasons we set up this podcast was because the extremely pervasive sense that there is no alternative that this book fully captures is not quite there to the extent, at least, that we would want to podcast about it. So, but I have one final point, and this is about the Nirvana question that we talked about earlier. I think he absolutely reads Kurt Cobain correctly. As a Pixies fan and somebody who really doesn't like Nirvana, I think he absolutely hits the nail on the head that Kurt Cobain's this rebellion was completely staged, and he knew it, and it was doomed, and therefore musically not very interesting. So Alex, you can cut that if you like, but I just wanted to get that in there as an investor. That's
good. I like that.
You're also a Pixies fan, so yeah.
No,
so
he's right.
So just to kind of put a bow on it a little bit, I think this has been the third in 3 episodes on liberalism, neoliberalism, capitalist realism. So if you've enjoyed this episode and you haven't listened to the last 2, then listen to the last 2. Okay, thanks. Bye.
That's authority for you. That's authority.
Things have never been so swell.